Good morning and welcome to Muskogee Church Online. I hope all of you are doing well. This week we are working on a Zoom meeting for the entire church body, so be watching for the information on that in your emails. Please stand and join us in singing. Darkness tries to roll over my bones. Sorrow comes to steal
Do you thirst for a drink from the well? Jesus is calling. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Leave behind all regrets and mistakes. Come today, there's no reason to wait. Jesus is calling. Bring your sorrows and trade them for joy. From the ashes a new life is born. Jesus is calling. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, what a Savior! Isn't He wonderful? Sing hallelujah! Christ is risen. Bow down before Him, for He is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah! Christ is risen. Oh, what a Savior! Isn't He wonderful? Sing hallelujah! Christ is risen. Bow down before Him, for He is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah! Christ is risen. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ.
Good morning, church. I'm so glad you could join us online this morning. We are right in the middle of a series called Encountering Jesus. Over the last couple months, we've been talking about stories from the book of John where people encountered Jesus in unique ways and Jesus was revealed as the Messiah to them. Now, we jumped out last week quickly to the book of Luke to talk about the two disciples onto the road to Emmaus. But this week, we're going to come back to John in John chapter 20, verse 24. Now, this is the story of Thomas, and he is one of the disciples, but he was not there when Jesus appeared to them in the locked room. And he comes back into the fold with the disciples and begins talking to them, and all of a sudden he is confronted with this story. that Jesus has appeared to them. Now, Thomas cannot believe what he's hearing. He thinks that they're maybe making it up or playing a prank on him. Now, the nature of doubt is pretty interesting to me. Doubt is something that we all as humans have. And especially today where our world is more divided and everybody is doubting everything that comes out. Trust is an issue. But I think of it this way. When I was a kid, I was a gullible kid. My family used to talk about snipe hunting. You ever heard of snipe hunting? It was this mythical bird that you could catch by rubbing toothpaste all over your hands and running around with a burlap sack in the woods. And they would all go hide in the woods and start making these bird calls as we kids would run around trying to chase snipes, going, here, snipe, 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 with toothpaste on our hands. It's the most ridiculous thing when you think about it, but that type of stuff happens all the time. And so as I grew older, doubt was just part of it. When I realized people were tricking me, I recognized that there was this possibility that people could just be messing with me. I did this to my brother. I used to convince him that quarters were more valuable than dollar bills. I would take my quarters and I would trade him for his dollar bills. I had convinced him that quarters were more important than dollars. Of course, they're heavier, they're better. And so somehow I would take 10 quarters and make $10. Our world is full of lots of things like that ask you to believe. Believe that if you send some money to a prince in Egypt, that you might get $1 million or more. There's lots of scams out there. So you go from being gullible to being very wary. Or in the case of Thomas, maybe he thinks his friends are just playing a prank on him, that they're messing with him. Jesus has appeared, don't you know? Now, what's interesting to me about this story specifically is that it isn't right at that moment that Jesus appears and comes back and tests Thomas's doubt. It's a week later. It's a week of him hearing these stories and thinking that they're messing with him. A week of him saying, unless I see his wounds and touch them, I won't believe. I can't believe. This is the setup for our story today, where Jesus appears once again into a locked room as he did before, saying almost exactly the same thing that he said to the disciples when he appeared into the room just a week ago. Peace be with you. Then he turned directly to Thomas. And this is what he says, put your finger here, see my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Now, of all the times that we're hearing people talk about the Messiah throughout this story, Thomas is actually more emphatic than any other because he says, my Lord and my God. He fully grasps who Jesus is in this moment. He's not just a savior or a Messiah. He is the Son of God. Now, what do we do with this story? See, I think doubt is a realistic thing for us to deal with, and it's quite normal. We get phrases from this story like seeing is believing. We call Thomas doubting Thomas. But in my mind, what he's going through is pretty normal. He didn't get to see. He didn't see Jesus come back, and truth is they could have been just messing with him. But in this moment, because he sees, he believes. Now, Jesus says something to him after that. And I want to make a point of kind of drawing this out a little bit. Jesus says to him after he confesses, "My Lord and my God, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed." Isn't that all of us? Isn't it every Christian that has walked the earth in more than almost 2,000 years? We weren't there for the resurrection. We didn't hear the stories firsthand. But somehow they've gone to our hearts, where we've been able to believe deeply in who Jesus was, in the resurrection. Now, I think it's not just because these stories exist, but if you pay attention to verse 30 in chapter 20, this is really the first ending of the book of John. Scholars think that there was kind of an added piece on, so anything after John 20 is really the second book of John. Now, this is what it says regarding itself. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That you might have life in his name. All the stories that we talk about through the book of John, one after the other, Jesus reveals himself as the Messiah. People confess that he's the Messiah. People are looking for something more, like Nicodemus. And it just grows and grows until we get to the point of Thomas's story, who has doubt, but ends up saying, "My Lord and my God." What a confession. I think it's also interesting that Jesus doesn't take his doubt as a rejection. It doesn't discount Thomas from participating in the life of Christ that he had doubt. See, we all have doubt, and it takes time to work through. I can know something, but as it sinks into my heart and to my spirit, it takes time. You may have doubts in your life. Doubts about what God is doing. Maybe frustrations. Why didn't God act? I thought this was supposed to be the way it was. But it turned out to be something else. Doubt is normal in the faith journey. And Jesus doesn't reject Thomas for having that. In fact, what he does is pretty interesting to me. He appears to the disciples. He directs himself, his entire conversation to Thomas, who is struggling with doubt, as if he knew that we would have the same issues. I can't see, and belief is difficult. I can't see, so trust is difficult. But then he invites Thomas to put his finger in his side and in his hands, to examine the wounds, to spend time working out his doubt. That's what we are called to do, to work out our faith with fear and trembling, to work out our salvation in front of God. And doubt is okay, it's part of that. In fact, I think the Gospels project doubt as a reality. More often, they talk about people who doubt as people of great faith. So what do we do with this story? I think we work through it. I think Jesus invites us to work through it. But there's a second level to this story. This book, the book of John, was written that you may believe. These stories were told because people couldn't be there on the first hand. They couldn't see it for themselves. They couldn't experience it in the way that the disciples experienced it. The woman at the well experienced it. That Mary and Martha experienced the resurrection of their brother. They just couldn't. They weren't there. And Jesus recognized that we're blessed if we can believe without seeing. Recognized that it would be an issue. But it's because of people telling their stories, of the disciples talking about what happened. Not just one person encountering Jesus, but several people encountering Jesus. Not just one person experiencing once the resurrected God, but the disciples and Thomas and all the women who went to the tomb. Their stories hold weight because it's their story. They're testifying. But here's my challenge, because the reason that Christians exist 2,000 years later, the reason that people know about Jesus around the world is not just because these stories were written, but because Christians throughout history have been telling these stories and their own. How God has been resurrecting things in their lives. They've been testifying to what God is doing. So for me, when I come to this point and say it's written that you might believe, it's been told that you might believe, I invite you into that. Because there's a whole bunch of people that struggle with doubt, without knowing. They don't know God, have a relationship with God, but they want one. And they need your stories. They need Thomas's story. And as they hear those stories, as they begin to have belief and faith, they also begin to have their own. And so generation after generation, the church grows, telling the story of the people of God, telling the story of the Messiah who came to save, the Messiah who was crucified, the Messiah who was resurrected. Church, this is good news. In the next few weeks, I'm going to be kind of embarking on a new project. We'll share the first piece of that next weekend, but I really want to hear your stories of resurrection. Now, I mean it this way. Where God has resurrected, changed your life, made things new. I want to hear those stories. I will set up a time with anyone who would love to go through an interview where we would just Zoom and meet and talk about how God changed their lives. And we're going to share some of these stories and talk about some of these stories because I believe God is moving even in the midst of the chaos we live in today. That people are having encounters with Jesus today, much like they did in the early church. So would you join me in this project? Would you go tell the story so that people would believe? Church, it's been great to be with you today. We just pray that you would be safe, that you would continue seeking Christ even when it's difficult, even when there are walls and city streets between us. We are still the church. I'm praying for you all. May God bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you, and may he be gracious to you. And by all means, go tell it on the mountain. Go in peace.